So one of the things that has happened over the last 15 years, and I think it goes in cycles, but I've seen that there has been a huge propensity for a lot of folks to be very interested in real estate. And this can be being a landlord, aka rental properties, or it can be flipping houses. And I've seen, the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes along in this journey. Specifically, I have a background of living in a resort community for my entire life and seeing what happens when the global financial crisis hits and people's home values drop significantly, and it can leave people in a serious lurch. So today I want to talk about some of the dangers and some of the challenges that go with real estate. And I think that there has been a little bit of a narrative over the last 15 years that has shown that real estate is just the greatest asset class of its time. And while it can be a terrific vehicle to create wealth, it's not necessarily the only way to create wealth. So first off, let's just kind of give it some background. So if we look at from basically like 2010, 2011 through 2022, we saw a very, what we would call an easy money policy, meaning interest rates were really low. And so there was money flowing into the system. And this was in response to the global financial crisis. So if we recall, there was a period of time when Janet Yellen was the Fed chair, and they were kind of just scratching their head. They were talking about quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, and they weren't seeing inflation. In fact, inflation was like stubbornly low. It was, sometimes 0, 1, less than 2%. And then all of a sudden, we fast forward to the COVID pandemic. We had to flood the market with a significant amount of capital, lots of cash coming in. So it went from a very free flowing cash, easy money policy to like a flood of cash, like just a tsunami of free money to the public. And this created, in my view, a huge problem with inflation, that tied with a couple of other things. Well, during that period of time, we were coming out of a crisis, a financial crisis that was hitting real estate specifically. And so we saw both easy money, meaning you could attain a loan very easily, relatively speaking. The banks were lending money left and right. And we had attainable home values, prices. So as an example, in 2011, I bought my first house for $200,000 in a very desirable neighborhood. And 2 years later, I was able to sell it for $300,000. So there was the ability to buy and sell and do some things within real estate that were relatively easy. So what we saw, or what I saw and experienced over that period of time, was that a lot of people were buying up real estate and they were saying the greatest investment because they saw growth, and it's likely because they bought at a really good time and they were able to sell. And so during that period of time, it was just a natural cycle where things kind of go down and then they come back up. And that can fool people into thinking that they are a bit smarter than they actually really are, and that it's actually the system that's allowing them to see those benefits. But save for that, another trend that I saw within that realm is people flipping houses. So they buy a house, it needs a little bit of lipstick, it needs a little bit of update, so they do a flip. They add a couple things, a new paint, and now they're on to, then they sell it, and they sell it for a pretty quick buck. And this can be a great thing until it's not. And you just have to really have one to let the whole house of cards fall. So what I want to talk a little bit about today is just the dangers of flipping houses. And I've seen this recently. A client of mine, in a good way, a client of mine is working and doing this at a higher level than a lot of folks that I've seen. And he's had his successes, and frankly, he's had some failures. But the idea is that you've got to stick with it. But in order to do this, there's a pretty significant learning curve in order to do it properly. So that's something that I would suggest that most people need to be very careful of, is the amount of attention and the amount of skill that actually goes into properly managing a real estate investment, and specifically with regard to flipping homes. So that is, again, what my background, my history is. Well, what is at risk? Well, the thing about real estate is that it usually uses a lot of debt. So you're borrowing 80% of a home's value, and you're able to turn that around and make a lot of money on the amount that you've invested. And so that leverage the bank loan allowed you to have really outsized returns. Well, guess what? If things go the other way and things don't go exactly how you want, you could be left holding the bag. You could be left underwater, which is basically that the value that you put in, so the amount of money that you put in is less than the amount that you can take out. So if you buy a house for $500,000, you put in $50,000, and you go to try to sell the house and you can only sell it for $525,000, then you'd be considered underwater. What gets really dangerous is if you go under the amount that you borrow from the bank. So if, let's just say, you buy a house for $500,000, you borrow for $50,000, and you put $50,000 in it. So now you're all in at the $550,000 level. But let's just say the market gets crushed, you're not able to sell. Let's say interest rates go up, because we certainly saw this, and they're just not a buyer's market or a seller's market. And all of a sudden you can only sell the house for $425,000, $430,000. What do you do then? What happens there? Equity is completely wiped out and you're way underwater. So that can go really bad and really go the other direction. And that's if you're just not doing the analysis, you're not doing the research on what the neighborhood can do. So this is something that I've seen as well, is that somebody wants to go into a neighborhood and they want to do some really big updates. The end product that they have doesn't actually work in that neighborhood. Meaning, let's just say that it's a $500,000 neighborhood and they put a bunch of money in and they want to sell it for close to $1 million. Well, guess what? That neighborhood doesn't support $1 million homes. And therefore, you've got to be aware of who the end buyer is. So when you enter it, you have to think about keeping the end in mind. Who is going to buy this home at the end of this process? And that's where you have to start from the beginning, is do your due diligence, do the research, understand what the market is looking like, understand the microeconomy, the micro community that you're even looking at. That could be 4x4 block of streets. That's the smallest size. That's super small geographic location, rather than maybe a macro trend of maybe even the city or the state. You've got to be aware of those microclimates within each of these neighborhoods, because that's going to propel or perpetuate what ultimately happens. So again, getting educated, understanding the risks that are involved. The other thing that you have to really be concerned about is managing costs. So when you go in and flip a house specifically, you've got to consider what it's going to cost and some of the details that you want. If you want to put faux beams or some of the things that maybe don't have a huge resale value, meaning that a buyer is going to come in there and look at it and not give it a lot of thought, that you have these faux beams or have some sort of a kitschy type of investment, and yet it cost you $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to do it. Things that you want to think about is making sure that bathrooms are solid, making sure that kitchens are up to speed, those sort of expenses. But even in managing the costs inside that, like as an example, if you're going to do a kitchen or a bathroom, what are you spending on tile? If you're spending the $12 a square foot tile, what's the return on your investment, rather than using the $3 or $4 a tile? And sometimes what the product is a little bit hard for the end consumer to really understand the difference between one price here and one price there. So making sure that you're understanding and keeping those costs in check. The other thing that you want to consider is who's doing the work. Is it you? Are you going to hire that stuff out? These are some of the other things that you've got to be careful of, because if you, let's say, hire a general contractor, there's going to be associated fees with that. And you've got to make sure that you vetted them. Have you worked with them before? Do they have a reputation that they're going to do good work? Because what you don't want to do is let this thing last, because time is of the essence when it comes to this type of projects. You don't want something to take 6 months longer than what you had budgeted, because there's holding costs, there are market risks that you run, there's a whole host of things that can happen if you're not careful when it comes to the timing. So these are some of the considerations, is working with somebody that you know, like, and trust, and that can get the work done in a reasonable time frame. So again, this is a little bit of something that would be helpful for those folks that are out there that might want to dip their toe in real estate. It's just to understand that there are risks associated, that the entire landscape has changed pretty dramatically over the last couple of years since we started to see interest rates come up. We've also seen some softening in the real estate market, where some of the prices are either stabilizing or in some cases coming down. So just be aware of where you are in the market. So this old adage of it's not timing the market, it's time in the market. So think about it from that perspective. Keep going, keep plugging away if you're going to start this process, rather than trying to time it exactly right. Make sure you're going to do the due diligence, you're going to do the research, you're going to do the steps that take to be successful in this type of an endeavor, because it is risky.